Barring out at schools. A curious custom used to obtain in some schools just before the Christmas holidays of barring out the master and keeping him out of the schoolroom until the boys' grievances had been listened to and promise of redress given, and the best account of this custom that I have ever met with is in the Gentleman's Magazine for 1828, Volume 2, page 404, etc. It was a few days before the usual period of the Christmas holidays arrived when the leading scholars of the head form determined on reviving the ancient but obsolete custom of barring out the master of the school. Many years had elapsed since the attempt had succeeded, and many times since that period it had been made in vain. The scholars had heard of glorious feats of their forefathers in their boyish years, when they had set the lash of the master at defiance for days together. Now, alas, all was changed. The master, in the opinion of the boys, reigned a despot absolute and uncontrolled. The merciless cruelty of his rod and the heaviness of his tasks were insupportable. The accustomed holidays had been rescinded, the usual Christmas feast reduced to a nonentity, and the chartered rights of the scholars were continually violated. These grievances were discussed seriatim, and we were all unanimously of opinion that our wrongs should, if possible, be redressed. But how the object should be effected was a momentous and weighty affair. The master was a clergyman of the old school, who for the last 40 years had exercised an authority hitherto uncontrolled, and who had no idea of enforcing scholastic discipline without the exercise of the whip. The consequences of a failure were terrible to think upon, but then the anticipation of success and the glory attendant upon the enterprise, if successful, was sufficient to dispel every fear. At the head of the Greek class was one whose very soul seemed formed for the most daring attempts. He communicated his intentions to a chosen few, of which the writer was one, and offered to be the leader of the undertaking if we would promise him our support. We hesitated, but he represented the certainty of success with such feeling eloquence that he entirely subdued our opposition. He stated that Addison had acquired immortal fame by a similar enterprise. He told us that almost every effort in the sacred cause of freedom had succeeded. He appealed to our classical recollections. Epaminondas and Leonidas were worthy of our example. Tarquin and Caesar, as tyrants, had fallen before the united efforts of freedom. We only had to be unanimous, and the rod of this scholastic despot would be for ever broken. We then entered enthusiastically into his views. He observed that delays were dangerous. The barring out, he said, should take place the very next morning to prevent the possibility of being betrayed. On a previous occasion, he said, some officious little urchin had told the master the whole plot, several days having been allowed to intervene between the planning of the project and its execution, and, to the astonishment of the boys, it appeared they found the master at his desk 2 hours before his usual time, and had the mortification of being congratulated on their early attendance, with an order to be there every morning at the same hour. To prevent the occurrence of such a defeat, we determined on organising our plans that very night. The boys were accordingly told to assemble after school hours at a well-known tombstone in the neighbouring churchyard, as something of importance was under consideration. The place of meeting was an elevated parallelogram tombstone, which had always served as a kind of council table to settle our little disputes, as well as parties of pleasure. Here we all assembled at the appointed time. Our leader took his stand at one end of the stone, with the head boys who were in the secret on each side of him. "My boys," he laconically observed, "tomorrow morning we are to bar out the flogging parson, and make him promise that he will not flog us hereafter without a cause, nor set us long tasks or deprive us of our holidays." The boys of the Greek form will be your captains, and I am to be your captain general. Those that are cowards had better retire and be satisfied with future floggings, but you, who have courage, and know what it is to have been flogged for nothing, come here and sign your names." He immediately pulled out a pen and sheet of paper, and, having tied some bits of thread round the finger ends of 2 or 3 boys, with a pin he drew blood to answer for ink, and to give more solemnity to the act. He signed first, the captains next, and the rest in succession. Many of the lesser boys slunk away during the ceremony, but on counting the names we mustered upwards of 40, sufficient, it was imagined, even to carry the school by storm. The Captain General then addressed us. "I have the keys of the school, and shall be there at 7 o'clock. The old parson will arrive at 9, and every one of you must be there before 8, to allow us 1 hour for barricading the doors and windows. Bring with you as much provision as you can, and tell your parents that you have to take your dinners in school. Let every one of you have some weapon of defence. Those who cannot obtain a sword, pistol, or poker must bring a stick or cudgel. Now, all go home directly, and be sure to arrive early in the morning." Perhaps a more restless and anxious night was never passed by young recruits on the eve of a general battle. Many of us rose some hours before the time, and at 7 o'clock, when the school door was opened, there was a tolerably numerous muster. Our captain immediately ordered candles to be lighted, and a rousing fire to be made, for it was a dark December's morning. He then began to examine the store of provisions and the arms which each had brought. In the meantime, the arrival of every boy with additional material was announced by tremendous cheers. At length the church clock struck 8. "Proceed to barricade the doors and windows," exclaimed the captain, "or the old lion will be upon us before we are prepared to meet him." In an instant the old oaken door rang on its heavy hinges. Some, with hammers, gimlets, and nails, were eagerly securing the windows, while others were dragging along the ponderous desks, forms, and everything portable to blockade, with certain security, every place which might admit of ingress. This operation being completed, the captain mounted the master's rostrum and called over the list of names, when he found only 2 or 3 missing. He then proceeded to classify them into divisions, or companies of 6, and assigned to each its respective captain. He prescribed the duties of each company. 2 were to guard the large casement windows, where it was expected the first attack would be made. This was considered a post of honour, and consequently the strongest boys with the most formidable weapons were selected, whom we called grenadiers. Another company, whom we considered as the light infantry or sharpshooters, were ordered to mount a large desk at the centre of the school, and, armed with squibs, crackers, and various missiles, they were to attack the enemy over the heads of the combatants. The other divisions were to guard the back windows and door, and to act according to the emergency of the moment. Our leader then moved some resolutions, which, in imitation of Brutus, he had cogitated during the previous night, to the effect that each individual should implicitly obey his own captain, and that each captain should follow the orders of the Captain General, and that a corps de reserve should be stationed in the rear to enforce this obedience and prevent the combatants from taking to flight. The resolutions were passed amid loud vociferations. We next commenced an examination of the various weapons, and found them to consist of 1 old blunderbuss, 1 pistol, 2 old swords, a few rusty pokers, and sticks, stones, squibs, and gunpowder in abundance. The firearms were immediately loaded with blank powder, the swords were sharpened, and the pokers heated in the fire. These weapons were assigned to the most daring company, who had to protect the principal window. The missiles were for the light infantry, and the rest were all armed with sticks. We now began to manoeuvre our companies by marching them into line and column, so that everyone might know his own situation. In the midst of this preparation, the sentinel, whom we had placed at the window, loudly vociferated, "The parson! The parson's coming!" In an instant all was confusion. Everyone ran he knew not where, as if eager to fly or screen himself from observation. Our captain immediately mounted to a form, and called to the captains of the 2 leading companies to take their stations. They immediately obeyed, and the other companies followed their example, though they found it much more difficult to manoeuvre when danger approached than they had a few minutes before. The well-known footstep, which had often struck on our ears with terror, was now heard to advance along the portico. The muttering of his stern voice sounded in our ears like a lion's growl. A death-like silence prevailed. We scarcely dared to breathe. The palpitations of our little hearts could, perhaps, alone be heard. The object of our dread then went round to the front window for the purpose of ascertaining whether anyone was in the school. Every footstep struck us with awe. Not a word, not a whisper was heard. He approached close to the window, and with an astonished countenance stood gazing upon us, while we were ranged in battle array, motionless statues, and as silent as the tomb. "What is the meaning of this?" he impatiently exclaimed. But no answer could he obtain, for who would then have dared to render himself conspicuous by a reply? Pallid countenances and livid lips betrayed our fears. The courage which 1 hour before was ready to brave every danger appeared to be fled. Every one seemed anxious to conceal himself from view, and there would certainly have been a general flight through the back windows had it not been for the prudent regulation of a corps de reserve, armed with cudgels, to prevent it. "You young scoundrels, open the door instantly!" he again exclaimed, and, what added to our indescribable horror, in a fit of rage he dashed his hand through the window, which consisted of diamond-shaped panes, and appeared as if determined to force his way in. Fear and trepidation, attended by an increasing emotion, now possessed us all. At this critical moment every eye turned to our captain, as if to reproach him for having brought us into this terrible dilemma. He alone stood unmoved, but he saw that none would have the courage to obey his commands. Some exciting stimulus was necessary. Suddenly, waving his hand, he exclaimed aloud, "3 cheers for the barring out, and success to our cause!" The cheers were tremendous. Our courage revived. The blood flushed in our cheeks. The parson was breaking in. The moment was critical. Our captain, undaunted, sprang to the fireplace, seized a heated poker in one hand and a blazing torch in the other. The latter he gave to the captain of the sharpshooters and told him to prepare a volley, when, with red-hot poker, he fearlessly advanced to the window-seat, and, daring the master to enter, he ordered an attack. And an attack indeed was made, sufficiently tremendous to have repelled a more powerful assailant. The missiles flew at the ill-fated window from every quarter. The blunderbuss and the pistol were fired, squibs and crackers, inkstands and rulers, stones and even burning coals came in showers about the casement, and broke some of the panes into 1,000 pieces, while blazing torches, heated pokers and sticks stood bristling under the window. The whole was scarcely the work of a minute. The astonished master reeled back in dumb amazement. He had evidently been struck with a missile or with the broken glass, and probably fancied that he had been wounded by the firearms. The schools now rang with shouts of "Victory!" and continued cheering. "The enemy again approaches!" cried the captain. "Fire another volley! Stay! He seeks a parley! Hear him!" "What is the meaning, I say, of this horrid tumult?" "The barring out! The barring out!" a dozen voices instantly exclaimed. "For shame!" says he, in a tone evidently subdued. "What disgrace are you bringing upon yourselves and the schools? What will the trustees, what will your parents say? William," continued he, addressing the captain, "open the door without further delay." "I will, sir," he replied, "on your promising to pardon us and give us our lawful holidays, of which we have lately been deprived, and not set us tasks during the holidays." "Yes, yes," said several squealing voices, "that is what we want, and not to be flogged for nothing." "You insolent scoundrels, you consummate young villains!" he exclaimed, choking with rage, and at the same time making a furious effort to break through the already shattered window. "Open the door instantly, or I'll break every bone in your hides." "Not on those conditions," replied our captain, with provoking coolness. "Come on, my boys, another volley." No sooner said than done, and with even more fury than before. Like men driven to despair, who expect no quarter on surrendering, the little urchins daringly mounted the window-seat, which was a broad, old-fashioned one, and pointed the firearms and heated poker at him, whilst others advanced with the squibs and missiles. "Come on, my lads," said the captain. "Let this be a Thermopylae, and I will be your Leonidas." And indeed, so daring were they, that each seemed ready to emulate the Spartans of old. The master, perceiving their determined obstinacy, turned round, without further remonstrance, and indignantly walked away. Relieved from our terrors, we now became intoxicated with joy. The walls rang with repeated hurrahs. In the madness of enthusiasm, some of the boys began to tear up the forms, throw the books about, break the slates, locks, and cupboards, and act so outrageously that the captain called them to order. Not, however, before the master's desk and drawers had been broken open, and every plaything which had been taken from the scholars returned to its owner. We now began to think of provisions. They were all placed on one table, and dealt out in rations by the captain of each company. In the meantime, we held a council of war, as we called it, to determine on what was to be done. In a recess at the east end of the school there stood a large oak desk, black with age, whose heavy hinges had become corroded with years of rust. It was known to contain the records and endowments of the school, and, as we presumed, the regulations for the treatment of the scholars. The oldest boy had never seen its inside. Attempts, dictated by insatiable curiosity, had often been made to open it, but it was deemed impregnable. It was guarded by 3 immense locks, and each lock was in the possession of different persons. The wood appeared to be nearly 1/2 foot thick, and every corner was plaited with iron. All eyes were instinctively directed to this mysterious chest. Could any means be devised for effecting an entrance, was the natural question. We all proceeded to reconnoitre. We attempted to move it, but in vain. We made some feeble efforts to force the lid. It was as firm as a block of marble. At length, one daring urchin brought from the fireplace a red-hot poker and began to bore through its sides. A universal shout was given. Other pokers were brought, and to work they went. The smoke and tremendous smell which the old wood sent forth rather alarmed us. We were apprehensive that we might burn the records instead of obtaining a copy of them. This arrested our progress for a few minutes. At this critical moment, a shout was set up that the parson and a constable was coming. Down went the pokers, and, as if conscience-stricken, we were all seized with consternation. The casement window was so shattered it could easily be entered by any resolute fellow. In the desperation of the moment, we seized the desks, forms, and stools to block it up, but, in some degree, our courage had evaporated, and we felt reluctant to act on the offensive. The old gentleman and his attendant deliberately inspected the windows and fastenings, but, without making any attempt to enter, they retreated, for the purpose, we presumed, of obtaining additional assistance. What was now to be done? The master appeared obdurate, and we had gone too far to recede. Some proposed to drill a hole in the window seat, fill it with gunpowder, and explode it if anyone attempted to enter. Others thought we had better set fire to the school sooner than surrender unconditionally. But the majority advised what was, perhaps, the most prudent resolution, to wait for another attack, and, if we saw no hopes of sustaining a longer defence, to make the best retreat we could. The affair of the barring out had now become known, and persons began to assemble round the windows, calling out that the master was coming with assistance, and saying everything to intimidate us. Many of us were completely jaded with the over-excitement we had experienced since the previous evening. The school was hot, close, and full of smoke. Some were longing for liberty and fresh air, and most of us were of opinion that we had engaged in an affair which it was impossible to accomplish. In this state we received another visit from our dreaded master. With his stick he commenced a more furious attack than before, and, observing us less turbulent, he determined to force his way in spite of the barricadoes. The younger boys thought nothing but flight and self-preservation, and the rush to the back windows became general. In the midst of this consternation our captain exclaims, "Let us not fly like cowards. If we must surrender, let the gates of the citadel be thrown open. The day is against us, but let us bravely face the enemy and march out with the honours of war." Some few had already escaped, but the rest immediately arranged themselves on each side of the school in two extended lines with their weapons in hand. The door was thrown open. The master instantly entered and passed between the two lines, denouncing vengeance on us all. But as he marched in, we marched out in military order, and, giving 3 cheers, we dispersed into the neighbouring fields. We shortly met again, and after a little consultation it was determined that none of the leaders should come to school until sent for, and a free pardon given. The defection, however, was so general that no corporal punishments took place. Many of the boys did not return until after the holidays, and several of the elder ones never entered the school again. End of Barring Out